I woke up to complete darkness, and the bitter cold creeping through every crack in my house, realizing that the worst ice storm in Colorado Springs history had just knocked out power to half the city, including my neighborhood in the Pinewood Ridge subdivision. The date was February 14th, 2026, and I'd been living in this house for exactly 3 years, long enough to know that our HOA president, Brenda Matthews, was the kind of woman who treated the neighborhood covenants like they were constitutional law. What she didn't know, as she made her rounds that freezing morning, was that I owned the very company currently working around the clock to restore power to the entire region. My name is Peter Donovan, and I'm the CEO and majority owner of Rocky Mountain Power Solutions, the second largest utility provider in Colorado. I'd worked my way up from being a lineman 20 years ago, bought out a struggling power company in 2019, and built it into something remarkable. Most of my neighbors had no idea what I did for a living because I kept to myself, drove a modest truck, and didn't advertise my success. I lived in a decent but not extravagant neighborhood because I liked the quiet streets and the mountain views, not because I needed to impress anyone. The storm had hit around 2 in the morning. I'd been on the phone with my operations manager, David, coordinating our emergency response team since 3. We had crews coming in from Wyoming and New Mexico to help, and I'd activated our mutual aid agreements with 3 other utilities. The ice accumulation was unprecedented, nearly 2 inches coating every power line and tree branch in the region. We were looking at thousands of downed lines and potentially a week-long restoration effort for some areas. By 7 in the morning, my house had dropped to 52 degrees. I dug out my old camping gear and set up a propane heater in the living room, but I knew that wouldn't last long. That's when I remembered the industrial-grade electric space heater in my garage, a powerful unit that I'd acquired through the company. The problem was, it needed electricity to run, and my home generator was currently in the shop for maintenance. I'd been meaning to pick it up, but hadn't gotten around to it. Instead, I fired up the space heater using my truck's power inverter, running an extension cord through the garage door. It wasn't ideal, but it would keep the house livable until I could get a proper generator delivered. I was standing in my kitchen, eating a cold breakfast and checking the outage maps on my laptop using my phone's hotspot, when I heard the knock. It was the kind of knock that conveyed authority and impatience, the sound of someone who expected immediate compliance. I already knew who it would be. Brenda Matthews stood on my porch, bundled in a designer winter coat that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payment. She was 53 years old, had perfectly maintained blonde hair that never seemed to move regardless of weather conditions, and wore an expression that suggested she'd been personally victimized by the ice storm. Behind her stood 2 other women I recognized from HOA meetings, her loyal followers who nodded along to everything she said. "Mr. Donovan," she said crisply, not bothering with pleasantries. "I'm conducting wellness checks throughout the neighborhood, and I couldn't help but notice you have an unauthorized heating device running from your vehicle." I took a sip of my now lukewarm coffee. "Morning, Brenda. Yes, I have a space heater running. It's keeping my pipes from freezing." "That's a safety violation," she said, pulling out a tablet and tapping at it with one manicured finger. "Section 12. Paragraph 4 of our covenants clearly states that no combustible or high-wattage heating devices are permitted without prior HOA approval. Additionally, running power cords through doorways creates a tripping hazard, which violates our liability insurance requirements." "It's an emergency," I pointed out, keeping my voice level. "The entire grid is down." "Be that as it may, rules exist for a reason," Brenda insisted. I'm going to have to ask you to surrender the device until power is restored. We're collecting all unauthorized heating equipment to prevent potential fire hazards." I stared at her for a long moment, wondering if she was serious. "You want to take my space heater during a power outage when it's 28 degrees outside? It's for the safety of the community," she said primly. "We've already collected 3 propane heaters and 2 other electric units. Everyone is making sacrifices, Mr. Donovan. You're not special." The women behind her nodded in unison. One of them, whose name I thought was Susan, chimed in. "We're all suffering together. It's only fair." I felt my jaw tighten. I'd dealt with difficult people throughout my career, from angry customers to incompetent bureaucrats. But there was something uniquely infuriating about HOA tyrants who wielded their tiny amount of power like a weapon. "Brenda, that's the stupidest thing I've heard all morning, and I've been dealing with a regional power crisis since 3 a.m. You're not taking my heater." Her eyes narrowed. "Excuse me." "You heard me. It's an emergency. Your covenant rules don't override basic common sense and survival." Brenda's face flushed red, and she drew herself up to her full height of maybe 5'5". "Mr. Donovan, I am the duly elected president of the Pinewood Ridge HOA, and I have the authority to enforce our community standards. If you refuse to comply voluntarily, I am authorized to enter your property and remove violations myself. It's in Section 3 of the covenants you signed when you purchased your home." I couldn't help it. I laughed. It wasn't a nice laugh. "You're going to forcibly enter my home and steal my property during a natural disaster. Do you hear yourself?" "It's not stealing, it's enforcement," Susan piped up again. "Tell you what," I said, pulling out my phone. "I'm going to call the El Paso County Sheriff's Office right now, and we can ask them if what you're describing constitutes burglary or just criminal trespassing. Which would you prefer?" Brenda's face went from red to purple. "You're being completely unreasonable." "Fine. Stay here and freeze if you want. But when you violate our covenants, there will be consequences. Fines, liens against your property, legal action. Don't think I won't pursue every available option." She spun on her heel, her companions following like ducklings, and marched back down my driveway. I watched her move to the next house, where my neighbor Tom lived. He was a retired schoolteacher, a nice guy who mostly kept to himself. 15 minutes later, I saw Brenda leaving his house carrying his propane heater. Tom stood in his doorway looking defeated and cold. That was when I decided Brenda Matthews had pushed her authority too far. I spent the rest of the morning coordinating with my team. The restoration effort was massive. We had crews working in zones, prioritizing hospitals, water treatment facilities, and emergency services first, then moving to residential areas based on the number of customers affected and the severity of the damage. My operations manager estimated 3 to 5 days before we'd have everyone back online, possibly longer if we hit complications. Around noon, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. "Mr. Donovan." "This is Margaret Chen from the State Public Utilities Commission. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. I'm in the middle of coordinating an emergency response to a major outage affecting 60,000 customers. So yes, it's a bad time, but go ahead," I said, watching another crew status update flash across my laptop screen. "I'll be brief. We've received a formal complaint about Rocky Mountain Power Solutions' response time to the current emergency. The complaint alleges negligence and inadequate preparation for weather events." I sat up straighter. "Who filed the complaint?" "A Mrs. Brenda Matthews, representing the Pinewood Ridge HOA. She claims your company has failed to meet basic service standards and is demanding an investigation. I was quiet for a moment, processing the sheer audacity. Miss Chen, are you aware of the current conditions? We have ice accumulation that's unprecedented in the past 30 years. We've activated every mutual aid agreement we have and deployed over 200 linemen. We're working as fast as physically possible. I understand, Mr. Donovan, and frankly, this complaint seems premature. But I'm required to log it and inform you officially. Between you and me, I think Mrs. Matthews is wasting everyone's time, but she's apparently very persistent. She's called my office 4 times today. After hanging up, I sat back and rubbed my eyes. Brenda wasn't just enforcing HOA rules anymore. She was actively trying to interfere with emergency utility operations. That crossed a line. The temperature in my house continued to drop despite the space heater. By early evening, it was down to 48 degrees. I bundled up in layers and kept working from my dining room table, now converted into a makeshift command center. My fingers were getting stiff from the cold, making typing difficult. That's when the knock came again. This time it was aggressive, demanding. I checked the security camera I'd installed last year and saw Brenda standing there with a man I didn't recognize, tall and heavyset, wearing a security guard uniform. I opened the door to the chain lock. "What now, Brenda?" "This is Carl Rodriguez from Summit Security Services. I've contracted him to assist with HOA enforcement during the emergency. You have one more chance to surrender your unauthorized heating device voluntarily, or Carl will assist me in removing it as outlined in our covenant enforcement procedures." Carl looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot. I addressed him directly. "Carl, I'm guessing Brenda is paying you personally for this, not through any official capacity. You should know that if you enter my home without permission and take my property, that's called burglary under Colorado law. It doesn't matter what an HOA covenant says. You'll be arrested." Carl's eyes widened slightly and he looked at Brenda. "Madam, I don't think I can do this." "He's right. This sounds like it could be illegal." "You're being paid to follow my instructions," Brenda snapped. "The covenant gives me clear authority." "The covenant doesn't supersede state criminal law," I said calmly. "Carl, you seem like a smart guy. Walk away from this." Carl took a step back. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Matthews, but I can't help you with this. I could lose my license." He turned and headed back to his truck, leaving Brenda standing alone on my porch. She glared at me with pure hatred. "You think you're so clever. You think you're above the rules. But I will find a way to make you comply, Mr. Donovan. This neighborhood has standards and you will respect them. Go home, Brenda. It's cold and getting dark. Focus on taking care of yourself instead of harassing your neighbors." She left, but I could tell this wasn't over. I'd dealt with enough difficult people in my career to recognize someone who would escalate rather than back down. The power stayed out through the night and into the next day. I maintained contact with my operations team, tracking crew progress across the entire service territory. We were making headway but hitting complications. Some transmission towers had collapsed under ice weight. Substations had equipment failures. Every repair seemed to reveal 3 more problems. My house reached 43 degrees by the morning of the second day. The space heater was still running, but it was fighting a losing battle against the cold seeping through every wall. I was wearing thermal underwear, 2 sweaters, and a winter coat inside my own home. My breath formed clouds in the air. I was on a conference call with my engineering team when I heard something at my garage door. I muted my mic and listened. There was definitely movement out there, scratching sounds, like someone was tampering with the lock. I grabbed my phone and pulled up the garage security camera I'd installed after having some tools stolen 2 years ago. The screen showed Brenda Matthews and another woman using some kind of tool on my garage door lock. As I watched, the lock popped and the door began to open. I unmuted my call. "I need to go. Emergency at my house. I'll call back in 20 minutes. I hung up before anyone could respond. I moved quickly through my house to the garage entry door. By the time I opened it, Brenda and her companion, who I now recognized as another HOA board member named Linda, were inside my garage, heading straight for my space heater. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I shouted. Both women jumped. Brenda recovered quickly, her face set in determined lines. "We're removing a covenant violation and safety hazard. You were warned multiple times. You just broke into my garage. That's breaking and entering. That's a felony in Colorado." "We have covenant authority," Brenda insisted, but her voice wavered slightly. "We're protecting the community." "Linda," I said, focusing on the other woman who looked considerably less certain than Brenda, "you really want a criminal record over an HOA dispute?" "Because I'm calling the sheriff right now." I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. Linda's face went pale and she grabbed Brenda's arm. "Brenda, maybe we should go. This doesn't feel right." "We're well within our rights," Brenda said, but she was backing toward the door now. The 911 operator answered. "911, what's your emergency? I have 2 people who just broke into my garage and are attempting to steal my property. I need a sheriff's deputy at 847 Ridgemont Drive in the Pinewood Ridge subdivision. Are the intruders still on scene?" "Yes, they're in my garage right now." Brenda's eyes went wide. She grabbed Linda's arm and practically dragged her out of the garage. I followed them out, staying on the line with dispatch, watching as they hurried down my driveway toward Brenda's silver Lexus SUV parked at the curb. "The intruders are fleeing in a silver Lexus, Colorado plate. I read off the license number. I have them on security camera breaking into the garage." The dispatcher assured me a deputy was on the way and advised me to stay inside and safe. I went back into my house, pulled up the security footage, and downloaded the video file showing Brenda and Linda clearly breaking into my garage. The video quality was excellent, showing their faces clearly as they worked on the lock. Deputy James Morrison arrived 20 minutes later. He was a solid-looking man in his 40s with the weathered face of someone who'd spent years working outside. I invited him into my cold house and showed him the video on my laptop. He watched it twice, his expression growing more serious each time. "You know these women?" "Brenda Matthews is the HOA president for this subdivision. Linda, I'm not sure of her last name, but she's on the HOA board. Brenda has been harassing me about having a space heater during the power outage. She thinks it violates HOA covenants and has been trying to confiscate it." Deputy Morrison shook his head slowly. "HOA covenants don't give anyone the right to break into someone's property. This is pretty clear-cut breaking and entering with intent to commit theft. Do you want to press charges?" I thought about it for a moment. Part of me wanted to just let it go, to avoid the hassle and drama. But then I thought about Tom, my retired neighbor, standing in his doorway as Brenda took his only heat source. I thought about all the other neighbors she'd probably bullied over the years, people who didn't push back because they didn't want the trouble. "Yes," I said. "I want to press charges." Deputy Morrison nodded. "I'll need a copy of that video file. I'm going to go have a conversation with Mrs. Matthews and her friend. I'll be in touch about next steps." After he left, I tried to get back to work, but I couldn't focus. My phone kept ringing with updates from my operations team. We'd restored power to about 40% of affected customers. The work was going as fast as possible, but it was brutal. Several of my crew members had been injured by falling branches. One guy had been hospitalized with hypothermia after working a 16-hour shift in the ice. We were pushing everyone to their limits. Around 5 that evening, I got a call from Deputy Morrison. "Mr. Donovan, I wanted to update you. I visited Mrs. Matthews at her residence. She initially denied everything, but when I mentioned the video evidence, she changed her story. She claims she had authority under HOA rules and that you're the one creating a public safety hazard. I've charged both her and Linda Foster with criminal trespass and attempted theft. They'll have to appear before a judge. What happens next?" "There'll be a court date set, probably in the next few weeks. The county attorney will review the case. Given the video evidence, I expect they'll pursue prosecution. Mrs. Matthews was pretty agitated when I left. She kept insisting she was within her rights and that I didn't understand HOA law." "Thanks for taking this seriously, Deputy. I know you've got more important things to deal with during a power outage. Actually, this is the third HOA-related call I've responded to today. People get weird during emergencies. Some of them think it's their chance to enforce all kinds of petty rules while everyone's distracted. Anyway, you might want to secure that garage door lock. I noticed they damaged it pretty badly." After we hung up, I went out to examine the garage door. They'd completely destroyed the lock mechanism trying to get in. I ended up having to prop a 2x4 against the door to keep it secure until I could get a locksmith out, which probably wouldn't happen until after the power was restored. That night was the coldest yet. My house dropped to 39 degrees. I seriously considered going to a hotel, but most of them were either without power or completely booked by other refugees from the outage. Instead, I piled every blanket I owned onto my bed, wore full winter gear to sleep, and tried to get a few hours of rest between emergency calls from my operations center. Day 3 of the outage brought a new complication. I received an official-looking letter, delivered by hand to my door by a process server. It was a cease and desist order from the Pinewood Ridge HOA, signed by Brenda Matthews and the other board members. It demanded I immediately remove my illegal heating device, stop harassing HOA officials, and pay a fine of $5,000 for multiple covenant violations and interference with HOA operations. The letter went on to threaten legal action, liens against my property, and foreclosure if I didn't comply within 48 hours. It was the most absurd document I'd ever read, but it was also technically legal correspondence that I'd have to respond to. I called my attorney, Richard Moss, a sharp corporate lawyer who'd handled various business matters for me over the years. I explained the situation, and he listened in what I imagined was stunned silence. "Peter," he said finally, "this is one of the most ridiculous HOA disputes I've ever encountered, and I've seen some bad ones. They have absolutely no legal grounds for any of this. The fact that they're threatening you after being charged with breaking into your garage is genuinely bizarre. Can they actually put a lien on my house? Theoretically, HOAs have lien rights for unpaid assessments and fines, but those fines have to be legitimate and properly assessed according to their own procedures. This is harassment, pure and simple. Let me draft a response. In the meantime, document everything. Every interaction, every threat, every communication. If this goes to court, we want a clear record of their behavior." That afternoon, power started coming back on in scattered pockets across the service area. My crews were making real progress now. We'd cleared most of the major transmission lines and were working through distribution systems neighborhood by neighborhood. I watched the outage map on my screen, seeing the red zones slowly turn green as sections of the grid came back online. My neighborhood wasn't prioritized yet. We were on a circuit that served mostly residential customers, no critical facilities, so we were further down the restoration queue. I'd specifically instructed my operations team not to give my area any special treatment. If anything, I wanted us to wait our turn like everyone else. It would be unethical to use my position to jump the line. By the evening of day 3, we'd restored power to 70% of affected customers. The worst was behind us, but we still had thousands of people waiting in the cold. My house was down to 37 degrees. I'd stopped feeling my toes hours ago. That's when Brenda showed up again. I saw her on my security camera, marching up my driveway with another official-looking document in her hand. I seriously considered not answering the door, but I knew that would just make things worse. When I opened the door, she thrust the paper at me. "This is a notice of an emergency HOA board meeting scheduled for tomorrow evening at 7 p.m. Your violations will be discussed, and the board will vote on sanctions. You're required to attend." I looked at the paper. It was indeed a meeting notice, properly formatted according to HOA bylaws. "Brenda, you do realize you've been criminally charged with breaking into my garage, right? Maybe focus on that instead of your petty HOA crusade. Those charges are baseless and will be dismissed," she said confidently. I was acting within my authority as HOA president. Meanwhile, your flagrant disregard for community standards continues. That meeting is mandatory. If you don't attend, we'll proceed without you and the sanctions will stand. "I'll be there," I said tiredly. "Is there anything else?" "Yes. I've filed a formal complaint with the Better Business Bureau about your power company's inadequate response to this emergency. I've also contacted 3 television news stations about Rocky Mountain Power Solutions failures. The public has a right to know when a utility company prioritizes profit over safety." I stared at her. "How do you even know where I work?" She gave me a smug smile. "I make it my business to know everything about residents in my neighborhood. When you applied for that building permit last year for your deck addition, your employment information was on the application. I keep thorough records. You investigated me. I performed due diligence. And when I learned that the CEO of the power company responsible for this disaster lives in my neighborhood, I knew the public needed to know. You're probably sitting in your cold house instead of being out there fixing the power lines, aren't you? Some leader you are." I took a deep breath, counting to 10 in my head. "Brenda, I've been coordinating emergency operations around the clock for 3 days. I've barely slept. I have over 200 crew members working in dangerous conditions to restore power as fast as humanly possible. Several of them have been injured. We're doing everything right by the book, prioritizing safety and critical infrastructure. Your complaint is baseless and, frankly, embarrassing. We'll see what the media thinks about that," she said. She turned and walked away, leaving me standing in my doorway in the freezing cold. I went back inside and immediately called my communications director, Sarah Chen. She handled all media relations for the company and was excellent at her job. I explained the situation, and she groaned. "I got a call from Channel 7 News today asking about our restoration timeline and mentioning they'd received complaints about our response. I didn't realize it was from someone you knew personally. Peter, this could get messy if she's really pushing this narrative. What should we do?" "Let me get ahead of it. I'll prepare a press release detailing our response efforts, the mutual aid we've activated, the number of crew members deployed, everything. I'll also reach out to the stations she contacted and offer interviews. We've got nothing to hide. Our response has been textbook. In fact, I'd argue we're performing better than most utilities would in these conditions. Do it. And Sarah, when you talk to the media, make sure they understand the scale of this disaster. 2 inches of ice accumulation. Unprecedented damage. This isn't a normal winter storm. I've got it covered. Try to get some rest if you can. Rest wasn't happening. That night, I got a call at 2 a.m. from my operations manager. One of our substations had caught fire during restoration efforts. No one was hurt, but it was going to delay power restoration for about 3,000 customers by at least another day. I spent the next 4 hours on calls with engineers and crew supervisors, working through contingency plans. By the time dawn broke on day 4, I was running on maybe 6 hours of sleep total over the past 96 hours. My house was still without power, hovering at 36 degrees. I'd moved my base of operations to my truck, running the heater periodically to stay warm while working on my laptop using the cellular hotspot. The HOA meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. that evening. I seriously considered skipping it, but I knew Brenda would use my absence as ammunition. At 6:30, I walked over to the community clubhouse, a small building at the entrance to the neighborhood where HOA meetings were held. The parking lot was surprisingly full. Apparently, word had spread that there was going to be drama. I recognized many of my neighbors filing into the building, most of them looking cold and tired. The clubhouse had a backup generator, so it was blessedly warm inside, probably the first time most of these people had been truly warm in 4 days. The meeting room was set up with chairs facing a table where the 5-member HOA board sat. Brenda was in the center, flanked by Linda Foster and 3 other board members whose names I didn't remember. The room was packed, probably 60 or 70 people crammed into a space designed for 30. Brenda called the meeting to order at exactly 7 p.m., running through standard procedural business before getting to what everyone was actually there for. Item 7 on tonight's agenda concerns multiple covenant violations by Mr. Peter Donovan of 847 Ridgemont Drive. Mr. Donovan has repeatedly violated Section 12, Paragraph 4 regarding unauthorized heating devices. He has refused to comply with lawful directives from HOA officials. He has harassed and threatened board members attempting to enforce community standards. And most egregiously, he has filed false criminal charges against board members who were simply trying to protect the community. I sat in the front row, keeping my expression neutral. Around me, neighbors whispered and murmured. Brenda continued. The board proposes the following sanctions: a fine of $10,000 for covenant violations, an additional $5,000 for harassment of HOA officials, and a mandatory cease and desist order requiring immediate removal of all unauthorized equipment. Furthermore, if Mr. Donovan does not comply within 48 hours, we will file a lien against his property and begin foreclosure proceedings. Mr. Donovan, you have 5 minutes to address the board. I stood up slowly, my joints stiff from days of cold and exhaustion. I walked to the front of the room and turned to face not just the board, but all my neighbors packed into the seats behind me. I'm going to tell you all a story, I began. 4 days ago, the worst ice storm in 3 decades hit our region. Within hours, 2 inches of ice had accumulated on power lines across 60,000 square miles. Trees collapsed. Transmission towers fell. Substations failed. It was a catastrophic weather event that knocked out power to 60,000 customers, including everyone in this room. I paused, making eye contact with people in the audience. I own Rocky Mountain Power Solutions. I'm the CEO. The moment the storm hit, I activated our emergency response protocols. I called in mutual aid from Wyoming and New Mexico. I deployed every available crew member. We've been working around the clock, prioritizing hospitals and critical infrastructure first, then moving systematically through residential areas. As of 6 p.m. tonight, we've restored power to 82% of affected customers. The remaining areas, including this neighborhood, should have power back within 24 hours. There were surprised murmurs throughout the room. Clearly, most people hadn't known who I was or what I did. During this emergency, I continued, I've been coordinating operations from my house, which, like all of yours, has been without power and heat. I've been working in the same cold conditions you've all endured. I set up a space heater to keep my pipes from freezing and to maintain a workspace so I could continue directing restoration efforts. That's when Brenda decided that enforcing HOA covenants was more important than common sense or human decency. Brenda's face was turning red, but I pressed on. She demanded I surrender my space heater during the outage. When I refused, she escalated repeatedly. She harassed me. She filed spurious complaints with state regulators. She broke into my garage, and yes, there's video evidence of that, which is why she's been criminally charged. And now she's threatening to foreclose on my home because I wouldn't let her take my heat source during a natural disaster. I turned to face the board directly. This isn't about covenant enforcement. This is about a power-drunk HOA president who can't stand anyone questioning her authority. She's put her ego ahead of common sense and basic human compassion. She stole space heaters from elderly neighbors who needed them. She tried to steal mine, and now she's trying to intimidate me with fines and foreclosure threats. The room had gone completely silent. I could see some neighbors nodding while others looked uncomfortable. So here's what's going to happen, I said, my voice hardening. I will not be paying any fines. I will not be removing my space heater until I decide to. And if this board attempts to file a lien against my property for these bogus violations, I will sue the HOA, every board member personally, and Brenda Matthews specifically for harassment, abuse of authority, and violations of Colorado's fair housing laws. My attorney is already preparing the paperwork. Brenda shot to her feet. You can't threaten this board. We have legal authority to enforce covenants. Your authority ends where criminal law begins, I shot back. You broke into my garage, Brenda. You committed a crime. The sheriff agrees with me. The county attorney agrees with me, and I'm betting a civil court will agree with me too when we discuss your pattern of harassment and abuse. One of the other board members, a nervous-looking man named Frank, cleared his throat. Perhaps we should table this matter until after the power is restored and everyone has had time to cool down. We will do no such thing, Brenda snapped. This board has a duty to enforce standards. I call for a vote on the proposed sanctions. I second the motion, Linda said quietly, though she wouldn't meet my eyes. All in favor of imposing $15,000 in fines and beginning lien proceedings against Mr. Donovan, Brenda said. She and Linda raised their hands. The other 3 board members sat motionless, looking anywhere but at Brenda. The motion fails 3-2, Frank said, relief evident in his voice. This matter is closed. Brenda looked like she'd been slapped. What? You can't just refuse to vote. We just did, another board member said, a woman whose name I thought was Patricia. Brenda, this has gone too far. You broke into a neighbor's home. You've been harassing people during an emergency. I'm done enabling this behavior. I move to immediately suspend Brenda Matthews as HOA president pending a full investigation into her conduct, Frank said. Do I have a second? Seconded, Patricia said immediately. All in favor, 3 hands went up. The vote was carried. Brenda's face went from red to white to purple, cycling through colors like a mood ring. "You can't do this. I've been president for 6 years. I've dedicated my life to this community." "You've terrorized this community," Patricia corrected. "And we're done. This meeting is adjourned." The room erupted in chatter as people started standing and stretching. Several neighbors came up to shake my hand or pat me on the back. Tom, the retired teacher, squeezed my shoulder and said, "Thank you." "She took my heater, and I've been sleeping in my car for 3 nights because it's warmer than my house." Someone needed to stand up to her. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders that I hadn't even realized was there. But as I was leaving the clubhouse, I saw Brenda standing by her car in the parking lot, on her phone, speaking animatedly to someone. The look she shot me was pure venom. This wasn't over. I could feel it. I got home around 9 p.m. to find my house finally warming up. The power had come back on while I was at the meeting. I cranked the thermostat, made myself a hot meal for the first time in 4 days, and took a shower that lasted 30 minutes. It felt like heaven. The next morning, I woke to headlines. Channel 7 News had run a story about the power outage response, featuring interviews with my communications director and footage of our crews working in dangerous conditions. The story was overwhelmingly positive, praising our rapid response and the professionalism of our teams. There was a brief mention of complaints received about the response time, but the reporter effectively dismantled those complaints by pointing out the unprecedented nature of the storm and our better-than-average restoration timeline, compared to similar weather events nationally. I got a call from Sarah around 10 a.m. "Have you seen the coverage? Just watched it. You did great work." "Thanks, but there's something you should know. I got a call this morning from a lawyer representing Brenda Matthews. She's threatening to sue us for defamation, claiming we implied she was unreasonable in her complaints about the power restoration." I rubbed my temples. We didn't even mention her by name in any of our statements. "I know." The lawyer, some guy named Peterson, said that because her complaint was public record, anyone could figure out she was the source. He's demanding we issue a public apology and retraction. Tell him to pound sand. We didn't defame anyone. We stated facts about our restoration efforts. If Brenda's feelings are hurt because her complaints were shown to be baseless, that's her problem. Over the next week, things escalated in ways I hadn't anticipated. Brenda filed a civil lawsuit against me personally, claiming I had defamed her character by telling neighbors she broke into my garage. Never mind that it was true and supported by video evidence. She also filed a lawsuit against the HOA itself, claiming she'd been illegally removed as president without proper procedure. I had to hire a defense attorney, a tough woman named Rachel Harper, who specialized in HOA disputes and had seen everything. She reviewed all my evidence, watched the security footage, read through the threatening letters, and shook her head in amazement. "Mr. Donovan, I've been practicing law for 23 years, and this is the most clear-cut case of HOA overreach and harassment I've ever seen. Not only is her lawsuit against you frivolous, but you have grounds for a substantial countersuit. She broke into your property. She harassed you during an emergency. She abused her authority as HOA president. You could probably get damages for emotional distress, legal fees, and punitive damages for her outrageous conduct." "I don't want her money," I said. "I just want her to leave me alone." "Sometimes the only way to stop a bully is to hit back hard enough that they don't get up again," Rachel said bluntly. "Let me file a countersuit. We'll include the HOA as a defendant too for failing to properly supervise their president and allowing this harassment to occur." Meanwhile, the criminal case was moving forward. The county attorney's office had reviewed Deputy Morrison's report and the video evidence. They decided to prosecute both Brenda and Linda for criminal trespass and attempted theft. Linda had hired a lawyer immediately and was cooperating with prosecutors, claiming Brenda had pressured her into participating and that she'd been uncomfortable the whole time. In exchange for her testimony, they were offering Linda a plea deal for a lesser charge. Brenda, on the other hand, was doubling down. She filed motions to dismiss, claiming she had legal authority under HOA covenants to enter my property. She filed complaints against Deputy Morrison, claiming he'd been biased and unprofessional. She even tried to get the video evidence excluded, arguing that I'd been recording her without consent, which wasn't how security camera laws worked in Colorado. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for March 15th, about a month after the original incident. I had to take a day off from work to appear in court, which annoyed me because we were still dealing with the aftermath of the ice storm. Some of the damaged infrastructure required complete replacement, and we were coordinating with manufacturers and contractors to get materials shipped in. El Paso County Court was busy that morning, packed with people dealing with various misdemeanors and minor felonies. I sat in the gallery waiting for Brenda's case to be called, watching a parade of DUIs, shoplifting cases, and domestic disputes. Finally, around 11 a.m., the bailiff called the People of Colorado versus Brenda Matthews. Brenda walked to the defendant's table with her attorney, a slick-looking guy in an expensive suit who probably charged $300 an hour. She was dressed conservatively, trying to look like a respectable community leader rather than someone who'd broken into a neighbor's garage. The prosecutor, an assistant county attorney named Jennifer Walsh, laid out the case efficiently. She presented the video evidence, Deputy Morrison's testimony, and Linda Foster's statement describing how Brenda had convinced her to participate. It was damning. Brenda's attorney argued that his client had been acting in good faith to enforce legitimate community standards and had no criminal intent. He characterized the incident as a civil dispute that had been inappropriately criminalized. Judge Michael Torres listened to both sides, reviewed the video evidence on a screen in the courtroom, and asked several pointed questions. Then he made his ruling. Mrs. Matthews, I've reviewed the evidence presented, and I find probable cause to believe you committed the crimes of criminal trespass and attempted theft. Your assertion that HOA covenants gave you authority to enter Mr. Donovan's property without permission is not supported by law. Covenants are civil contracts. They do not grant anyone the right to trespass or seize property, regardless of the claimed violation. This case will proceed to trial. Bail is continued on your own recognizance. Brenda's face crumpled. Her attorney put a hand on her arm, but she shook him off and stormed out of the courtroom. I left shortly after, satisfied that justice was moving forward. The civil cases were slower. Rachel filed our countersuit in late March, seeking damages of $150,000 for harassment, emotional distress, abuse of process, and interference with my property rights. The HOA was added as a defendant for failing to properly control their president's actions. The lawsuit included all the evidence of Brenda's behavior, the threatening letters, the break-in, the attempted theft, and the pattern of harassment during the emergency. The HOA's insurance company got involved at that point. They sent their own attorney to review the situation, and within 2 weeks, they'd reached out to Rachel about settlement discussions. The insurance carrier wanted this case to go away quickly because it was a public relations nightmare. An HOA president, criminally charged for breaking into a resident's home during a natural disaster, made for terrible optics. The settlement offer came in mid-April. $75,000, a written apology from the HOA board, removal of all fines and sanctions from my record, and a guarantee that Brenda Matthews would be permanently barred from serving in any HOA leadership position. In exchange, I dropped the lawsuit against the HOA itself, though I'd continue pursuing Brenda personally. Rachel advised me to take it. It's a good offer. The HOA itself was actually a victim of Brenda's conduct too, in a way. They acted appropriately once they understood what was happening by removing her from office. Getting them to pay for her behavior punishes the wrong people, your neighbors who have nothing to do with this. I agreed. We accepted the settlement. The HOA insurance paid out, and I donated the entire $75,000 to a fund that helped low-income residents with their utility bills. It seemed appropriate given how the whole thing started. Brenda's personal lawsuit against me was dismissed with prejudice in May. Her defamation claims were found to be baseless because truth is an absolute defense to defamation. My countersuit against her personally was still pending, but her attorney was making overtures about settlement. Apparently, Brenda was having trouble paying his fees and was facing financial strain from the multiple legal battles. The criminal trial was scheduled for June. Linda Foster had taken a plea deal, receiving 6 months of probation and community service. She'd provided a detailed statement about Brenda's behavior, describing a pattern of intimidation and overreach that went back years. Other neighbors started coming forward too, telling stories about Brenda's harassment over minor covenant violations, her threats and bullying tactics, her abuse of HOA authority. I attended the trial, which lasted 3 days. The prosecution presented the video evidence, witness testimony, and a mountain of documentation showing Brenda's pattern of behavior. Her defense attorney tried to argue that she'd believed in good faith that she had authority to enter my property. But that argument fell apart under cross-examination when he couldn't cite any actual legal authority for that belief. The jury deliberated for 4 hours before returning a guilty verdict on both counts, criminal trespass and attempted theft. Judge Torres scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks later. At the sentencing hearing, the prosecutor asked for jail time, arguing that Brenda had shown no remorse and had continued to harass me and other neighbors even after being charged. Brenda's attorney asked for probation, claiming his client had learned her lesson and that jail time would be excessive for a first-time offender. Judge Torres split the difference. He sentenced Brenda to 90 days in county jail with work release privileges, 3 years of probation, 200 hours of community service, and mandatory counseling for anger management and control issues. He also ordered her to pay restitution for the damage to my garage door lock and court costs. Mrs. Matthews, the judge said as he handed down the sentence, you abused a position of trust and authority in your community. You allowed your desire for control to override common sense and basic human decency. During a natural disaster, when your neighbors needed help and support, you instead harassed and intimidated them. Your actions were not only criminal but fundamentally contrary to the spirit of community that HOA leadership is supposed to foster. I hope you use this time to reflect on your behavior and make meaningful changes. Brenda was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, crying. I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and sadness. I'd never wanted things to go this far, but she'd left me no choice. The civil lawsuit resolved a month later. Brenda's attorney contacted Rachel and offered a settlement, $20,000, everything Brenda could scrape together from her savings, plus a written apology. In exchange, I'd agree to drop all claims and not pursue any additional remedies. I almost said no. The amount was far less than what we'd been seeking, and frankly, I didn't care about her money. But Rachel pointed out that bankrupting Brenda completely wouldn't serve any purpose. She'd been held accountable criminally and was facing serious consequences. Taking everything she had would be vindictive rather than just. I accepted the settlement. The written apology arrived a week later. 2 pages of single-spaced text in which Brenda acknowledged her wrongful conduct, apologized for the harassment and break-in, admitted that she'd abused her authority as HOA president, and took full responsibility for her actions. It was surprisingly genuine, without any of the defiance or self-justification that had characterized her behavior throughout the ordeal. I donated the $20,000 to the same utility assistance fund that had received the HOA settlement money. It felt right to turn something ugly into something that would help people. The HOA held elections in July for a new president. Patricia, one of the board members who'd voted to remove Brenda, ran unopposed and won easily. One of her first acts was to call a special meeting to revise the covenant enforcement procedures, adding specific limitations on board authority, due process protections for residents, and clear guidelines about when rules could be suspended during emergencies. The new procedures passed with near-unanimous approval from the neighborhood. Tom, my neighbor who'd had his propane heater confiscated, stopped by my house in August with a 6-pack of beer and a thank you card. "I know this whole thing cost you time and money and energy," he said. "But you did something important. You stood up to a bully when a lot of us were too scared or too tired. The neighborhood is better for it." We sat on my deck. The one I'd needed a building permit for that had inadvertently revealed my identity to Brenda, and drank beer and watched the sunset over the mountains. It was a good evening, peaceful and quiet. Brenda completed her jail sentence in September and started her probation. I saw her occasionally around the neighborhood, usually from a distance. She kept her head down and didn't make eye contact with anyone. Her husband, who I'd barely seen during the entire ordeal, was apparently seeking a divorce. The combination of criminal conviction, community shame, and financial strain had destroyed their marriage. I felt a twinge of sympathy, but only a twinge. She'd brought this on herself through her own choices and her inability to admit when she was wrong. Rocky Mountain Power Solutions continued to grow. The ice storm had actually enhanced our reputation because our response had been so professional and efficient compared to other utilities dealing with similar weather events. We picked up several new municipal contracts and expanded our service territory into western Kansas. The company was doing well, and I was proud of the team we'd built. In October, I got an unexpected visitor. Linda Foster, Brenda's former sidekick, knocked on my door on a Saturday afternoon. She looked nervous, clutching a small bakery box. "Mr. Donovan, I hope I'm not bothering you. I wanted to bring you these cookies and apologize in person. I know I already gave a statement to the police and testified, but I never actually said I was sorry directly to you." I invited her in, and we sat in my living room. She explained that she'd been intimidated by Brenda for years, afraid to stand up to her because Brenda had threatened to make her life miserable in the neighborhood. When Brenda had asked her to help confiscate my space heater, Linda had gone along because she didn't know how to say no. "I know that's not an excuse," she said. "I made my own choices and they were wrong. I'm grateful the prosecutors gave me a plea deal, but I also know I deserve to be punished. I've been doing my community service at a homeless shelter, and it's taught me a lot about perspective and what really matters. I just wanted you to know that I'm genuinely sorry for what I did." I accepted her apology. She seemed sincere, and unlike Brenda, she'd owned her mistakes and worked to make amends. Sometimes that's all you can ask for. As fall turned to winter, life in Pinewood Ridge returned to normal. The new HOA leadership was reasonable and focused on actual community improvement rather than petty enforcement. Covenant violations were handled with friendly reminders instead of threats. The neighborhood felt more relaxed, more like an actual community instead of a dictatorship. I kept the space heater in my garage, more as a symbol than anything else. I'd also installed a new heavy-duty lock and added more security cameras. Not because I expected another break-in, but because the experience had reminded me that you can't be too careful about protecting your property and your rights. In December, nearly a year after the ice storm, I attended the HOA holiday party at the clubhouse. It was well attended, with neighbors bringing food and drinks and actually enjoying each other's company. Patricia, the new president, gave a short speech thanking everyone for their patience during the leadership transition and expressing hope for continued community improvement. Tom found me by the punch bowl and raised his cup in a toast. To surviving Karen and the ice storm, may we never face either again. I laughed and clinked my cup against his. I'll drink to that. As I drove home that evening, I reflected on everything that had happened. A simple ice storm and a space heater had spiraled into criminal charges, lawsuits, and a complete upheaval of neighborhood leadership. It seemed almost absurd in retrospect, but it had taught me important lessons about standing up to bullies, the importance of documentation and evidence, and the need to hold people accountable when they abuse authority. I'd also learned that most people, when given the chance, will do the right thing. The other HOA board members had ultimately sided with justice over loyalty to Brenda. My neighbors had supported me once they understood what was happening. The criminal justice system had worked as it should, holding someone accountable for breaking the law regardless of their claimed authority. The power company continued to thrive. We implemented new protocols based on our experience with the ice storm, improving our emergency response capabilities and investing in infrastructure hardening to prevent future outages. The lessons learned during that crisis made us a better company and better prepared for whatever weather challenges lay ahead. As for Brenda, I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she'd moved away after completing her probation. Her ex-husband had gotten the house in the divorce settlement and sold it to a young family with 2 kids. They were nice people who actually used their backyard for barbecues and play sets, instead of maintaining it as a pristine showpiece. I never saw Brenda again after that sentencing hearing. Part of me wondered if she'd ever truly understood why what she did was wrong, or if she still believed she'd been right and the world had treated her unfairly. I hoped she'd gotten something from the counseling and community service, that maybe she'd developed some self-awareness and perspective. But I'd never know, and honestly, it didn't matter. She was no longer my problem or my neighborhood's problem. Life moved on as it always does. The ice storm became a memory, then a story to tell new neighbors about that crazy winter when the HOA president went rogue. My space heater stayed in my garage, a reminder that sometimes the smallest things can become the biggest battles, and that standing your ground matters even when it's difficult. I continued to run Rocky Mountain Power Solutions, serving customers across Colorado and beyond, making sure the lights stayed on and the power flowed. It was meaningful work, important work, and I was good at it. The company had weathered the storm, both literal and figurative, and come out stronger. And every time I drove into Pinewood Ridge, past the community entrance with its manicured landscaping, and the clubhouse where that dramatic HOA meeting had taken place, I felt a sense of satisfaction. Not because I'd won some petty dispute, but because I'd helped restore sanity and fairness to a community that had been held hostage by one person's ego and need for control. The neighborhood had its problems, like any place where people live in close proximity. There were still disputes about parking and noise and fence heights, but they were handled reasonably now, with communication and compromise rather than threats and intimidation. That was the real victory, the lasting change that made everything else worthwhile. As winter approached again, 11 months after the ice storm, weather forecasters started predicting another harsh season. I made sure my generator was serviced and ready. I stocked up on supplies. I checked and rechecked our company's emergency protocols. We were prepared this time better than before, ready for whatever nature threw at us. And if another ice storm hit, if the power went out again, I knew I'd be able to use my space heater in peace, without some petty tyrant trying to steal it in the name of covenant enforcement. That was worth all the hassle, all the legal fees, all the stress and drama. Because at the end of the day, your home is supposed to be your castle, your refuge, the place where you're safe from the chaos of the world. No one, not even an HOA president with delusions of authority, has the right to take that away from you. And if they try, sometimes you have to fight back, stand your ground, and remind them that there are limits to power and consequences for overreach. I learned that lesson well during that long, cold February, and I carried it with me into everything I did afterward. Stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. Document everything. Know your rights and defend them. And never let anyone bully you into submission, no matter what authority they claim to possess. Those principles served me well in business and in life. They were worth remembering, worth teaching to others, worth fighting for when necessary. Because tyranny, whether it's exercised by a government or a homeowners association, must be resisted. Freedom and fairness don't maintain themselves. They require constant vigilance and the willingness to stand up when someone tries to take them away. The ice storm had tested all of us, my community and my company and me personally. We'd all passed that test, though not without difficulty and pain. But we'd emerged stronger, wiser, more prepared for future challenges. And isn't that what adversity is supposed to do? Break you down so you can build yourself back up better than before. I sat in my warm house on a cold December evening, the anniversary of the ice storm approaching, and felt grateful for everything that had happened, even the difficult parts. Because those experiences had shaped me, taught me, made me into someone who wouldn't back down from doing what was right even when facing opposition and harassment. The space heater sat in my garage, cleaned and maintained, ready if needed. But more importantly, the principle it represented, the idea that sometimes you have to stand firm against unreasonable authority. That lesson had been learned and internalized not just by me, but by an entire neighborhood. Brenda Matthews had tried to use an emergency as an opportunity to exercise her authority, to put me in my place, to prove that she was in charge. Instead, she'd learned the hard way that authority without wisdom is tyranny, and tyranny eventually falls. Her legacy wasn't the well-maintained neighborhood she'd envisioned, but a cautionary tale about what happens when power goes to someone's head. My legacy, I hoped, would be different. A successful company that served customers well and treated employees fairly. A neighborhood that stood up to a bully and reclaimed its sense of community. A reminder that ordinary people can fight back against petty tyrants and win. As I turned off the lights and headed to bed that evening, I glanced at the thermostat showing a comfortable 72 degrees. The power was on, the heat was flowing, and my home was my own. No one was going to take that away from me, Not an ice storm, not an HOA president, not anyone. And that, more than any legal victory or financial settlement, was the real triumph of the whole saga. The knowledge that I'd stood my ground, defended my rights, and emerged victorious against someone who thought rules gave them unlimited power over others. The ice storm had passed. Brenda Matthews had fallen. Life had moved on. But the lessons remained, etched in memory and experience, ready to guide me through whatever challenges lay ahead. And I faced those future challenges with confidence, knowing that I could handle whatever came my way, because I'd already survived the storm and the Karen who thought she owned it.